Houses have memories. Some just refuse to stay buried. They fester. Riley, a 28-year-old graphic designer with eyes that held the deep, weary exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, but a spirit that hadn't yet been broken, had inherited her grandmother's old house. It was a beautiful, creaky Victorian place on the edge of town, set back from the road and flanked by 2 ancient, gnarled oak trees. For Riley, it was meant to be her refuge from a chaotic world. A place filled with the faint, lingering scent of her grandmother's baking and the warmth of happy childhood memories. She moved in alone, believing with every fibre of her being that she had finally found her sanctuary. But within weeks, the sanctuary began to show its teeth. It started subtly. The lights in the kitchen would flicker and die for no reason, only to blaze back to life moments later. An electrician came, checked the wiring from top to bottom, and found nothing. "Old house," he'd said with a shrug. "They have their quirks." Then the cold became more pronounced. The air would turn instantly, bitingly icy, even at the height of a blistering summer. She could be sitting on her sofa, bathed in sunlight from the window, and suddenly a pocket of frigid air would settle over her, so cold it felt like a physical weight. A presence. And then, just as quickly, it would be gone. And then came the sounds. At night, when the rest of the world was asleep, she would hear it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the upstairs hall. But these were not the light, shuffling steps of her memory. This was the slow, heavy, deliberate drag of men's dress shoes on old hardwood, a weighty, melancholic patrol back and forth, back and forth. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was the only living soul in that house. One morning, she came downstairs to find the attic door. A heavy, solid oak door she always kept bolted, standing wide open. Hesitantly, she climbed the narrow stairs. Inside, dust-covered boxes were toppled and thrown aside, their contents spilling onto the floorboards, as if a frustrated, phantom thief had been searching for something they could not find. Nothing was taken. Nothing of value was even touched. It was an act of pure, desperate frustration. The true haunting experience wasn't the shadows she saw flickering at the edge of her vision, or the doors that creaked open on their own. It was the constant oppressive feeling of being watched, day and night. A heavy, sorrowful gaze that followed her from room to room. She felt it when she was cooking dinner, when she was in the shower, when she was lying in bed, staring into the darkness. Her friends, trying to be helpful, offered their logical dismissals. "It's just the stress of the move," one said. "You're alone in a big house for the first time. Your mind is playing tricks on you." They suggested therapy, a vacation, a sleeping aid. They meant well, but their words only deepened her isolation. But Riley knew. She knew, deep in her bones, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that fear doesn't creak floorboards in a specific, repeating pattern. Stress doesn't slam attic doors at midnight. Grief doesn't leave pockets of ice in a sun-drenched room. So she found me. A last resort. She came hoping this spirit medium reading could be a translation service, a way to finally understand what the world, beyond the veil, was trying so desperately to say. It's funny, isn't it, how we can love a place, a house, so much that we choose to ignore its whispers. We paint over the stains, we fix the rattling windows, we turn up the music to drown out the moans, until they start screaming. Riley's hands trembled on the polished surface of my table. as if the old brass key she held was burning the house's secrets directly into the palm of her hand. Some truths don't just die. They seep into the wood, the mortar, the plaster, and wait for the right soul to listen. As Riley spoke, her voice shook with the weight of sleepless nights. It's like she's there. My grandmother. I feel her presence. It's calm. But there's something else. Something heavy, angry. Like the walls are holding a secret too big for them. She told me how every room seemed to breathe with her, how the bathroom mirrors would fog over. When she asked questions aloud into the emptiness, how a voice, always just out of reach, like a poorly tuned radio, kept repeating her name at dawn. In all my real psychic stories, I've learned that what we think is a haunting is sometimes a plea for closure from beyond the veil. One night, the clearest event of all occurred. She heard the living room piano play a single note. The same melody her grandmother used to hum softly when she thought no one was listening. But underneath that familiar, melancholic note, there was a deeper, dissonant echo. Like another presence waiting for its turn to speak. I leaned across the table, my voice a whisper. What the living bury, the house remembers. If you want peace, my dear, you must let it speak. Riley's eyes darted to the flickering candle between us, as if expecting it to answer back. Some houses don't just echo, they beg. They hold on to the unfinished stories, waiting for someone brave enough to write the final line. I took a deep breath, centering myself, and began to shuffle my deck of tarot cards. Each card humming with the restless, agitated energy Riley had carried into my study. They felt electric in my hands. The candles in the room, which had been dancing, suddenly burned strangely steady, their flames straight and tall. But a sharp, unnatural draft cut through the window cracks, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the wind outside. It was a cold that settled deep in our bones. I laid the deck on the table and cut it once. Then I drew the first card, the moon. I placed it face up between us. The image was stark. Secrets, illusions, deep, murky waters of the subconscious. It represents the unseen truths that govern our lives from the shadows. The things we know in our gut, but refuse to acknowledge with our minds. Riley shivered audibly as the wind rattled the window pane with a sudden violent gust. Her hand went to her coat pocket, and she pulled out a small, tattered object. It was an old photograph she had found wedged under a loose floorboard in her bedroom, right by one of the recurring cold spots. It was a black and white picture, faded and creased. In it, a much younger version of her grandmother stood smiling, her face full of life and light. But she was not alone. Standing next to her, with his arm possessively around her waist, was a handsome man with dark, brooding eyes, a man Riley had never seen before. She turned it over. On the back, written in elegant, faded ink, was a single word: forgive. As if summoned by the image, a large black crow landed on the window ledge outside, its feathers like polished jet. It tilted its head and watched us with beady, ink-black eyes. A silent, knowing observer. And then, it happened. The air in the room grew thick with the unmistakable scent of cigar tobacco. It wasn't a stale old smell. It was fresh, pungent, and so overwhelmingly strong that Riley gasped and covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and recognition. My grandfather, she whispered, her voice cracking. That's his brand, but he left when my mom was just a child. He abandoned the family, at least. That's the story we were always told. A voice sliced through the silence of the room. It was not mine, and it was not hers. It was raspy, dry, full of decades of regret, and it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a voice from the very walls around us. I never left. I was hidden. Tell her. The true haunting experience wasn't about ghosts rattling chains or spectral figures in white sheets. It was about secrets buried alive, buried in the silence of a family, buried under the floorboards of a home. It's strange and beautiful and terrifying how the dead speak loudest through the smallest, most insignificant clues. A familiar scent on the air, a cold draft on a summer day, a single word etched on the back of a forgotten photograph. That night, in that room, the tarot cards weren't just paper and ink. They were a key. They were confession. They were revelation. And they were finally release. Riley stared at the space in the air where the voice had been, tears now streaming freely down her face. "What does he mean?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "What really happened?" The cards on the table seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I knew the house itself was whispering its truth through me, through them. I drew the next card. The Tower. The image is one of utter devastation. A tall structure, struck by lightning, crumbling to the ground as figures fall from its heights. It means collapse, ruin, sudden shocking revelation. It represents the complete and total destruction of a structure that was built on a foundation of lies, so that the raw, undeniable truth can finally emerge from the rubble. And the truth came. Her grandmother had not been abandoned. The man in the photograph was indeed her grandfather, and he hadn't left. He had died. In that house, the story that poured forth was one of betrayal, public shame, and a terrible scandal. He had been a proud man, a respected man in their small town, but he had made a disastrous business deal, betrayed by a partner, and lost everything. The family name was ruined. The shame was too much for him to bear. The story told to the children, to the town, was that he had packed his bags and left in the night. It was a lie constructed to protect the family name, to shield his young daughter from a much darker truth. But the guilt, the shame, the explosive energy of that final, desperate event, it never left the floorboards. His spirit had remained, trapped in the home where his life had fallen apart. Too proud to move on, too broken to forgive himself for the ruin he believed he had caused. That's why the house creaked with his heavy, pacing footsteps. That's why it sighed with his unending regret. That's why it waited for decades. For someone to come who could finally hear his side of the story. Riley clutched the photograph to her chest, her body shaking with sobs, as the wind outside let out one final mournful howl, like a last confession screaming into the night. And then, silence. A profound, deep, and total silence. The wind died down. The draft in the room vanished. The house seemed to shudder one last time, a great releasing tremor. And then it settled into a peace it hadn't known in 50 years. Sometimes a haunted house isn't haunted by a malevolent ghost at all. It's just haunted by a broken heart. A heart that never had the chance to explain, to apologize, to say goodbye. And when that goodbye finally comes, when the truth is finally spoken, the house sighs, the air warms, and the chains of the past are broken. I repeated the spirit's final message to Riley, my voice soft. He's asking you, his bloodline, to forgive what they all kept silent for his sake. He wants you to live free of this fear, So this house, his home, can finally breathe again. Riley wept, but for the first time in months, her tears were not from fear or confusion. The fear was gone. It had evaporated from the room, replaced by a strange, warm calm that spread through her body like a balm. It was the feeling of a fever breaking. In my years of conducting spirit medium readings, I have seen firsthand how a house, a single physical structure, can become a vessel, holding the unresolved pain of entire generations. It holds it in its foundation, its walls, its very air. But I have also seen with equal certainty how a single real psychic story, a single moment of honest communication, can free both the living and the dead. When she stood up to leave my office that night, she said, the old brass key felt impossibly light in her hand, no longer a burning weight of secrets. As she opened the door, we both noticed it. The wind outside had completely settled into a quiet, peaceful hush. The stars seemed to shine with a softer, gentler light. The house, which had waited so long, screaming in the only ways it knew how, could finally rest. Riley sent me an email a few days later. She told me that she went home and slept with her bedroom windows wide open that night. For the first time since she moved in, she wasn't afraid. There were no footsteps in the hall. There were no cold spots blooming in the dark. There was no disembodied voice calling her name. There was just the gentle sound of crickets outside and a warmth in the house she hadn't felt since she was a small child, sleeping over at her grandmother's, safe and sound. Sometimes, that's all forgiveness is. Unlocking a door, opening a window and letting the fresh air move freely through rooms that were once sealed shut by secrets. I told her in my reply, "No house is ever truly haunted by ghosts, my dear. It's the truths we refuse to hear that make the walls weep. And so I ask you, as you sit in your own space, in your own quiet rooms, what secrets do your walls keep? What unspoken griefs or long-buried regrets have seeped into the place you call home? What truth is begging to breathe through the cracks you've meticulously painted over for so many years?" This haunted house story is your reminder. Sometimes the ghost that keeps us awake at night is just the story we never had the courage to tell. The spectre in the hall is our own unresolved past, waiting for us to finally turn and face it. If you could ask your house one question, if you could press your ear to the wall and know that it would finally talk, what would you ask it? Think about it. Write it in the comments if you feel brave. I read every single word, and if you wish to keep crossing this veil with me, to explore the mysteries that lie just beyond our sight, don't forget to subscribe. Ring that bell for notifications and stay close, because the next haunting we explore, oh, it might just be yours.